Hello fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today I'm going to take on the Herculean task of trying to deep read Michael Moorcock's The Final Program. And I say this is a Herculean task because this is an incredibly complex book that shoots off, I guess is the best way I could say it, in many different directions. It deals with certain tropes in science fiction, but just surface level on some and in depth on others. But it also invents new tropes. And of course, saying inventing a new trope is a little bit of an oxymoron because a trope is something that is repeated. But these tropes have to come from somewhere, and I feel like that Michael Moorcock was probably the first to really bring in the underground movement that ended up, I guess, being called the hippie movement, although I don't know if that's a great way to describe it. But he writes about this movement, this counterculture youth movement, as it was just blooming, as it was just in its infancy in 1965. So he writes about things that now can seem kind of tropey, but when he was writing them were the most cutting edge thing you could write about. And we'll get into that deeper as we get into those sections. But if you're interested in hearing about the publication history of this book and other information, I did a short review of this before doing this deep read, so you can look that up. If you haven't seen it before this, you can go watch it now and then come back to this. But if you've already read this and are just looking for a deep dive discussion into the plot of this book, this is the video for you. So with that, let's get started. So the book starts with a chapter called Preliminary Data, and it is where we first meet our hero or anti-hero of this book. His name is Jerry Cornelius, and he is at Angkor Wat. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And while he's there, he meets a Hindu physicist named Hida, and they have a conversation about the Hindu belief that the Earth travels in cycles, that it goes through cycles. And he brings up the concept that he and Jerry might, or he at least wonders whether he and Jerry might meet again in a future cycle, that if they'll meet on the same day in the same place once the cosmological cycle begins again. Real kind of heady stuff to start. But I really enjoyed the concept, this idea that the book opens with the introduction of these cycles or patterns, and gives us or leads us to the concept that one cycle is ending and they're about to start a new one, which I think is important to the concept of the plot of this book. Professor Hida also brings up that he was speaking to a woman named Mrs. Bruner recently, and that she was talking about something that she called the final equation, which is interesting. Jerry's not really impressed. And it's just kind of a throwaway line at the end of this prologue, this preliminary data. But it, of course, becomes very important to the book. So the next part of the book is called Phase 1. And it opens at a person's house named Mr. Smiles. And there's a group of important people there who are waiting for Jerry Cornelius to arrive, because they're having some kind of major discussion. And these people all seem like they're somehow connected to, I don't want to say crime, but they seem like they're planning something that is criminal. And Jerry shows up. There's a lot of people introduced here, and I will tell you now, a lot of them are kind of unimportant. Just in the sense that they're not with us long in the book. But he does meet Mrs. Bruner, who, of course, is very important in this book. She was already mentioned in the preliminary data, and here she is again. And she seems like, when we first meet her, to kind of have this guy named Dimitri addicted to her in kind of what almost seems like a bondage style, in definitely in a sexual sense. They seem to be playing a master-servant game with each other, and Dimitri is definitely the servant. Jerry shows up. He's very stylish. Michael Moorcock goes into great detail talking about how cool his clothes are, and how kind of he's very skinny and fashionable, this Jerry Cornelius. Anyway, he finally shows up. He meets Mrs. Bruner, who is taken with him right away, and they are discussing a robbery of one of Jerry's father's properties. Apparently there's some kind of microfilm in the house that his father owned, and his father was, I believe, an inventor, a scientist, working specifically in hallucinogenics. And Jerry was supposed to take over everything, but his brother ended up taking it all over. Yeah, his brother Frank has gotten control of all of his father's, or this specific compound of his father's, and is keeping their sister, Catherine. So there's Jerry, Frank, and Catherine, and he's keeping his sister there too. And it seems like Jerry is not really interested in the heist to steal the microfilm from his father's secret compound. He's more interested in, it sounds like, some kind of revenge on Frank, or getting his sister Catherine back. So he agrees to help them with this raid on his compound, which is the only way they're going to be able to do it, because this compound is very well guarded, along with a lot of Jerry's father's inventions, but also there's kind of an army there that watches the place. So Jerry says, yes, I'll help you, but first I need to do something on my own, so we'll meet in a couple of days and do it then. People are like, we need to do this quick, and he says, no, we'll do it when I'm ready. And he goes to the compound himself, sneaks in through the with the help of an old servant, and has a confrontation with Frank, but he also sees his sister. Now, Frank seems to be a chemist / drug addict. He's constantly strung out, and he's constantly creating new drugs. And he has their sister, Catherine, sedated to such an extent that she's never awake. It seems like she's always drugged. And Jerry finds her. I get a real sense, a kind of an incestuous sense from these two. I think Jerry and his sister are lovers, and that's the reason he's trying to get her back from Frank. So his brother tries to capture Jerry, I'm assuming for the same fate, to be drugged, but Jerry uses nerve gas grenades to escape and gets out of the compound. We then cut to the gathering of all these individuals that want to raid this compound, and they go through with the raid. And it's crazy because there's these defenses that the house has that Jerry's dad invented. When they are walking up to the house, these pillars pop up and they flash lights, and they are able to kind of entrance people, but they're also connected with drugs, so people that Jerry say have weak minds are easily taken over by these weird drug pillars that shoot lights out, and maybe it's just the lights. LSD plays a very strange role in this book. We're going to have to talk about it a lot as we go through this video. So they get in, and instantly they have to block their nose and try not to breathe, because they go into this maze and it's flooded with LSD. When they're coming up to the house, my favorite description of it, and I guess that's one thing that I should say now, Moorcock's writing and prose is absolutely incredible. he could write about any weird subject, and I think I would enjoy it thoroughly because he writes about things so well. But he gives us an interesting metaphor when he's first coming up to the house, in that he thinks that the house kind of looks like a skull, and that to him this house is like going inside his father's head. And they get in, and one of the people that are there to raid with Jerry, or that Jerry's there to raid with, breathe in this LSD, and they keep popping up as they're trying to break their way in further and further into this compound. And he starts claiming that the place is haunted, that the house itself is a skull, and he keeps saying, it's my skull, it's my skull. And Jerry says, no, I know exactly whose skull it is, referring back to the fact that this house is like his dad's head to him. Anyway, it's obviously very trippy. This whole first section feels to me like James Bond taken to a much darker degree. It's got that kind of coolness and swag that the 60s really connected to. Although I will say, and I don't think Moorcock, I think Moorcock meant this to be the case. Jerry is a very strange protagonist. He seems dangerously close to being a sociopath. He doesn't... But that's not completely true. There's a lot of signs through his actions that he lacks a lot of empathy, but he does have emotional responses to things. But for instance, this guy that breathed in the acid, Jerry, he's talking about, this place is haunted, it's my head, and Jerry just shoots him in the head. And the rest of the team's like, what the hell? And he's like, yeah, that he was gone. There was no coming back for him. It was over. And he just kind of nonchalantly moves on. And he's constantly shooting or killing people in ways that seem just completely uncaring. And we'll see more of these as we go through the novel. I never felt like Jerry was the type of protagonist that I would want to be, or anything like that. He is definitely a complex character. He has good things going on, and he has very bad things going on as well. I can see why Michael Moorcock stuck with him throughout. Anyway, they finally make it to the room where the microfilm is. Oh no, they finally find Frank, his brother Frank. And the Mrs. Bruner starts torturing him to make him open the room where the microfilm is. And Jerry takes off to find Catherine. And he has to leave the house and go to a little cabin on the grounds there. And Catherine has been taken by Frank. So he goes back into the house, finds Catherine. She's just waking up from this drug-induced slumber she's been in. And Frank is in the room, and they fight. And Frank, they each have these little needle guns that shoot needles that their father made for them and gave them each one. And they're shooting at each other, and they keep missing each other. And then eventually Frank hits Jerry, and he's put some kind of drugs on his needles. And Jerry tries to shoot Frank and kills Catherine, the person that he's come to save. So unfortunately, he kills his sister. Also unfortunately, Frank is able to trick Miss Bruner. She goes in, tries to find the microfilm, and it's not there. And he's escaped by then. And Miss Bruner and Jerry end up being the only survivors, and they have to escape. And they do. And of course, Jerry is super hurt, so he ends up passing out. And that ends phase 1. Of course, at this point, I was super confused because Miss Bruner is continuously talking about she wants to build a computer that will have all the knowledge of mankind, which made me think of the internet again. And Jerry keeps talking about the world is going to fall apart. But he still has time to enjoy the world before the world falls apart. And I don't know if he knows something. The book's called The Final Program, so I kept thinking to myself, are they in a computer? Is this like a Harlan Ellison I have no mouth concept, where they're stuck in this computer? And it is true that there are many passages in this that Jerry questions his reality, whether he's in the right reality or not. So I feel like the book kind of points to that concept, although it doesn't end up that way. That's not the plot that Moorcock was talking about. But there's definitely a question of what is reality. I also was afraid that this book was going to be a little bit more action-oriented than I was necessarily interested in for sci-fi. But the next phase, phase 2, put all of that at ease for me, because phase 2 is a completely different beast from phase 1. Obviously, Jerry feels guilt for having killed his sister, but it's so weird because it doesn't come up often. There's just a couple of mentions in it, but I think Moorcock was showing us through Jerry's actions kind of how he dealt with grief. What he basically does is goes to this neighborhood in London where he loves to hang out and party, and he parties. And Moorcock is able at this point to kind of give his ideas or his thoughts on the underground. And Michael Moorcock really did have his finger on the pulse of the underground. I talked about in the last video, of course, that he worked with Hawkwind and was a major player in this scene as it went on. And I like very much this next part of the book because it's somebody writing about what they think this movement is right before the movement gains its momentum. This was written a couple of years before Pink Floyd came out with their first album, before they were playing the UFO Club and were kind of the band of the underground. This is before all of that really exploded, right before. And this seems like a weird part in the book because it's just kind of about a guy partying, but it is really so much more than that because of the prose and the ideas that Michael Moorcock is pushing forth. And I wanted to read a couple of passages about that. But before this first passage, and I should have done this slightly earlier, but it's okay. This is the very end of phase 1 after he's killed his sister. And of course he is drugged at this point by Frank from the needle gun that Frank shot him with. But I really want to read this just to demonstrate how well Moorcock was able to write psychedelic prose. Out of all the psychedelic sci-fi that I've read so far, which is not a small amount, I feel like Moorcock was kind of the king of it. I mean, these prose are incredible. This is on page 65 of my copy, the Avon 68 copy. Jerry sat himself down on the edge of the bed. He was riding a black Ferris wheel of emotions. His brain and body exploded in a torrent of mingled ecstasy and pain. Regret, guilt, relief. Waves of pale light flickered. He fell down a never-ending slope of obsidian rock surrounded by clouds of green, purple, yellow, black. The rock vanished, but he continued to fall. World of phosphorescence, drifting like golden spheres into the black night. Green, blue, red explosions. Flickering world of phosphorescent tears falling into timeless, spaceless wastes. World of guilt, 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 guilt. Another wave flowed up his spine. No mind, no body, nowhere. Dying waves of light danced out of his eyes and away through the dark world. Everything was dying. Cells, sinews, nerves, synapses, all crumbling. Tears of light, fading, brilliant rockets streaking into the sky and exploding all together and sending their multicolored globes of light Balls on a Christmas tree, Xmas drifting slowly, black mist swirled across a bleak horizon nightscape. Catherine. As he approached her, she fell away, fell down like a cardboard dummy. Just before his mind cleared, he thought he saw a creature bending over them both, a creature without a navel, hermaphrodite and sweetly smiling. This hermaphrodite creature without a navel will become important later. Also, I did forget to mention another thing about the end of Phase 1. Dimitri and Miss Brunner both survive at first, but when they go into the office to get the microfilm, Dimitri disappears. Once Jerry returns after the death of Catherine, Jerry returns and Dimitri is gone, but his clothes are... No, I don't even think they mention his clothes. He's just gone. Dimitri's gone. And Miss Brunner seems to know something about it, but isn't saying anything about it. And this really confuses Jerry. So anyway, Jerry wakes up in a hospital. It's been weeks. He's been in a coma, but he feels very well rested, and he decides to go and party in London in order to, I think, probably try to find a way to release all these pent-up emotions that he has about what happened with his brother and his sister. So he meets an acquaintance of his called Shades. He goes to this, I think it's a pinball parlor or pachinko, I can't tell which. But anyway, he goes to this hangout, and there's a band that's going to play later. No, that happens at I think it's called the Bum Club. But he meets this guy named Shades that he knows that is an assassin and has claimed that he's the one that killed JFK. And he's got a girl that's underage with him, and then another of-age girl that is Swedish. And Jerry takes a like to the Swedish girl, and she starts hanging around with him. And they go to the Bum Club, and the band starts playing, and Jerry sits in with them. He plays a song with them. And I really loved this. I love music, and I love music specifically from this era and on. And the way that Michael Moorcock discusses music is so interesting because, and I've already said this once, but this is when the seed was about to break. So the song that they play is by the Beatles. It's I'm a Loser, which is I was very cutting edge at the time, of course. Is that the one that starts with feedback? I'm not sure. But anyway, Jerry sits in and plays, and he says that he's waiting for this instrumental section to come. And when it comes, the band really opens up. And in the book, he says they play this song for a half an hour. And this, to me, looks forward to Pink Floyd, to Hawkwind, to a lot of the real progressive stuff that was going on in London just a year or two later. We see it mentioned here in this book. The idea of a half an hour long jam version of I'm a Loser fits perfectly in 1967. It's great to read it here in 1965. There's another point I want to read here, and this is Jerry's thoughts, but I also think it's Michael Moorcock's thoughts on exactly what this movement meant and kind of what it would be in the future. Jerry is a bisexual in this novel, and of course this was the beginning of the movement that would eventually climax with the Summer of Love. Aimlessly, he wandered among the pin tables and fruit machines, bent over by happy young men who worked them excitedly, hand in hand. Jerry sighed and thought that the true aristocracy who would rule the 70s were out in force. The queers and the lesbians and the bisexuals, already half aware of their great destiny, which would be realized when the central ambivalence of sex would be recognized fully and the terms male and female would become all but meaningless, here they were. As he wandered, he was surrounded by all the possible replacements for sex, one of several of which would become the main driving force for the humanity of circa 2000. Light, color, music, the pin tables, the pill dispensers, the gun ranges, scarcely replacements for sex anymore, but natural replacements. The birth rate, which if it had continued at the speed predicted in the early 60s, would have produced by 40,000 a planet consisting, core and crust, of nothing but human beings, was a dead pigeon to modern statisticians in Europe. Europe, as usual, was ahead of the world. Most of those who hadn't been able to stand the pace had emigrated off to America, Africa, Russia, Australia, and elsewhere, where they could wallow in the nostalgia produced by American fashions and television shows and mass opinion. African rural life, Russian moral attitudes, and Australian cold mutton. The flow had been two-way, of course, with the passengers for 1950 going one way and the passengers for 2000 coming the other. Only France, Switzerland, and Sweden, temporal and temporary bastions, hung back and stood soon to be shaken to pieces in the imminent pre-entropic wash of crisis. It was not a change of mood, Jerry thought, but a change of mind. Jerry no longer had any idea whether the world he inhabited was real or false. He had long since given up worrying about it. What I loved most about this is that, all politics aside, because I know these are now very heated topics, I feel like Michael Moorcock's view of what the movement, the counterculture youth movement of the 60s in London was and was becoming, was pretty spot on. It saw the issues that would become very important to us in 2000. And it's funny that he mentions 2000. It's also funny that he mentions people that can't handle it going one way and people that can handle it going one way. And he says the people that can't handle it were the 50s and the people that can handle it were the 2000s. This book was ahead of its time. And it's very interesting for me to see the movement that, to me, I grew up with. This is going to sound strange, but to me it was this quaint historical time. That it wasn't a quaint historical time before my time. It was an incredible, well thought out philosophical movement that had important things to say, and I just thought that was really, really cool. Anyway, eventually Miss Bruner shows up, and apparently she had paid for his hospital stay while he was in the coma, and he's not interested in anything because really all he wanted to do was free Catherine, and she had died, so he doesn't have any real drive to do anything at this point. But Miss Bruner's like, hey, there's this astronaut, I gotta figure out what his name is. An astronaut named Newman had written this manuscript, and I can't remember if he'd gone crazy or disappeared, but either way, this Newman manuscript is said to include some really incredible scientific information. And Frank has it, Jerry's brother, and has escaped to somewhere in Sweden up towards the North Pole with this manuscript, and Jerry's interested in this manuscript. Miss Bruner also mentions that she has that Frank still has the microfilm, and she still really wants that because she's still obsessed with this idea of a computer and this final program idea. So Jerry is interested in the manuscript and she's interested in the microfilm, so they decide that they're going to head off to Sweden together. But before they do that, it turns out that Miss Bruner is looking for another sex servant, and this time she's settled on a woman named Jenny, and she has to go meet her. So Jerry gives him a ride, and they go to this wrestling match and meet Jenny. And Jerry is way into Jenny. He likes Jenny. He's like, I'm going to have to steal Jenny from Miss Bruner. But first up, we got to deal with all this Sweden stuff. So they all decide to stay at Miss Bruner's house. And Jerry stays there. And the next morning they get up to go. And Jenny is disappeared. and all that's left are her clothes. And Jerry really is confused by Miss Bruner's ability to make people disappear, as I was as a reader as well. So Jerry and Miss Bruner take a helicopter, his personal helicopter, and they fly up to Sweden, and they meet this priest, this local priest that is staying at this old weather station, and the priest tells Jerry and Miss Bruner that he can sense something evil in them, and Jerry says the concept of evil is outdated. It's over with this new revolution. The concept of morals are breaking apart, and they all go together and find this cave. And this aspect of the book was so fun because it's really liminal. And they find this cave that leads deep into the earth. And as they're going in, they talk about the concept of hollow earth, a sci-fi trope that had been visited many times before this book, of course. But they talk about the fact that maybe this is something that his dad had discovered that Frank knew about because of the microfilm. And they find this lake of boiling water. And they go across the lake and they meet Frank, and there's a showdown, and Frank ends up dying. He falls into the boiling lake and dies. And Miss Bruner takes the microfilm, and Jerry grabs the manuscript and reads through the manuscript, this lost Newman manuscript that is by this astronaut that might have had an experience out in space. I have no idea. But he's super excited about this manuscript, and all it says is ha 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 for like 240 pages or something wild. I can't remember how much it is, but it's just ha 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 the whole time. So Jerry just kind of throws it into the lake. And this is another moment where I was confused by Jerry's actions. He grabs the boat, the only way they can get back across the lake, and leaves Miss Bruner and the preacher guy there. He just abandons them and takes off. And it could be that I'm reading it wrong. Perhaps what he's saying is, when he says he left them there, it's saying that they didn't want to go. Because I know Miss Bruner is interested in these caves. So I don't know if he abandoned them, or if that was just a way of saying they went their separate ways there. I don't know, but either way, it seemed like at first that he really just was like hijacked the boat and left them there. I don't know what is actually the case. Okay, so I checked, and that as far as I've gotten now was phase 2. So we're just coming up to phase 3. And phase 2 it's probably the longest phase in the book, and it's also my favorite. I really enjoyed phase 2. First, I liked that we got to see Michael Moorcock looking at the just growing scene coming out of London, a scene that would eventually affect large swaths of the planet. And I liked seeing his take on that and what he felt were the tenets of that. And I loved the liminal cave that they went into to find Frank. It was all very mysterious, and I really enjoyed those sections. But that brings us on to phase 3. So Frank is now dead. Jerry basically murdered him. Catherine is dead. Jerry accidentally killed her. And he is truly alone. So he goes back to London, decides that he's going to try to bury, I think, all this grief in partying, in drugs and partying. So he throws this party at his mansion that lasts for months. And he's sleeping with different people, and really different people are showing up. It's a complete open door. Anybody can come in at any time. And this party's going on and on and on. And eventually Miss Bruner walks in. And she talks with Jerry and tells him that she explored all those caves. And she found in the caves these old Russian or Nazi warheads. So apparently they were, I can't remember if it was Russia or Nazi. I know there's some Nazi stuff in there, but I think Russia was doing something. Anyway, she found these old warheads in these caves in Sweden, and they still were active. I think she could still make them work. So she basically blackmailed all the countries around her, and she finally has got enough money that she's able to build this computer that she's excited about that will have all the knowledge of humanity in it. And she's got this list of all the people that she still needs for this project. And she asks Jerry if she can recruit from his party, and he says, sure, go ahead. I'm done with it anyway. So he leaves the party and goes into London and realizes that London has begun to decay. And the book describes this in such a way that it seems like reality has begun to decay. And he goes to a coffee shop, and it seems like all the people in London now are kind of this fleshy crowd. It seems like they're all connected somehow into this fleshy thing. And this one part of the crowd separates. And it looks to him like his friend Shades. And he talks to him, and Shades is like, I don't know who you're talking about. And it creeps him out enough that finally he just shoots this part of the crowd. And everybody starts surrounding him, and he says he thought he had more time living before this happened. This is the only part of the book that I have a very hard time trying to figure out. I don't know if he's in a different reality or if he knows something about the future that we don't. Or it could be that he's just making a statement about the general people of London around this time through metaphor, that he's kind of saying they're all sheep, all part of one thinking blob of a crowd. Either way, it didn't bother me that I wasn't able to understand this. That was fine. I was okay with that. I think he checks one more place, and he sees the band that he played with earlier. They've all turned into these weird fleshy mounds, and he realizes that he's truly alone now. So he goes back to his house and talks with Miss Bruner again. No, Miss Bruner shows up at the club he was at, checking on his friends. Suddenly she speaks from behind him and says, you're completely isolated now. And he turns around, and Miss Bruner has sharp teeth and is kind of revealed herself as the monster that she is. Moorcock calls her, well, Jerry calls her two different kinds of monsters. In this particular scene, I think, well, maybe it was a later scene, he calls her a succubus. And then later he also calls her a vampire. And I don't think either of those things were true. And I want to stop just a minute and talk about what Miss Bruner could possibly be. So what we know about her is right after she went into the lab, right after they broke into Jerry's father's compound, into this middle room that was so protected, looking for the microfilm, her servant at that point disappeared, and nobody really knows why. Then we know that Jerry came upon Miss Bruner right after she had made love to Jenny, and Jenny disappeared, leaving behind only her clothes. And then at the the party where she came to see Jerry, and I forgot to mention this just a second ago, Jerry leaves and goes into London, and then she catches up with him in London. But right before she leaves, there is one chapter from her point of view in this book, and I believe it's the only chapter from her point of view in this book. And it doesn't say anything directly, but the priest that she had brought back from Sweden, he disappears, and leaving only his clothes, and then somebody is dressed up in his clothes, and it seems like she takes that person on to be the next servant. So she has this weird kind of sex power where she can make people disappear through sexual relations. And the first time we see it, it is connected, well, it happens in that stronghold room of Jerry's father. So perhaps she's a vampire or a succubus of old, but I feel like Moorcock is pointing towards more science fiction elements here. And I want to say that it's connected to the LSD and hallucinogenic experimentation that was going on with Jerry's father. So maybe she saw something in the lab that allowed her to realize that she could do this. And later, and I'm just going to jump forward a little bit, and I'll talk about it when it comes. But later, Jerry is able to do the same power. He's able to make a person disappear while having intercourse with them. And Miss Brunner explains that anybody can do it. It's just something that you have to kind of learn or know how. So I'm guessing and this whole book is a mix of science and spirituality, just like a lot of the new wave science fiction out of England at this time, which is really my favorite stuff. So this has a mix of both. So it's some kind of power that Moorcock, through Miss Brunner, states is inherent in all mankind, but that I think he hints at might have been learned by Miss Brunner through the stuff that she found in the stronghold of the compound of Jerry's father. Who knows? But that's just kind of my take on it. There's another part where we learn that Jerry wrote a scientific treatise that he was offered the Nobel Prize for, but turned down the Nobel Prize. And Miss Brunner at one point, this is in phase 2, Miss Brunner says, you made a mistake. There's one mistake in your logic, in your science, in your math. And he says, only the thing that I was talking about having the possibility of existing would be able to catch that mistake, hinting at the idea that Miss Brunner is something that Jerry felt like could exist and had created science and math to explain how it could exist. For a while there, I was wondering if Miss Brunner was a robot and that she was the final program, which didn't pan out. That's not the answer at all. So anyway, that's about Miss Brunner. She starts to seduce Jerry, and he tries to resist, and he can't. She somehow seduces him, and she says, you have to come see this computer I'm building in Sweden, in the caves. It's called Duel, D-U-E-L. And they go to see this computer that she's building. And Jerry gets there, and he meets Professor Hida there working on the machine, and he can't really figure out why Miss Brunner is using her powers of seduction on him. But eventually she says, I have a son, and my son's... Oh, it gets really strange here. Anyway, she claims that she has a son, and the son's father was fighting with, or fought with, Jerry's father. And she wants Jerry to go get some final notes that he's refusing to give her. This is her son, and she says, I need you to go get it, and she says he won't give it to you, but then you should kill him and take it. So Jerry goes to London. He uses the fact that he's the son of the person, that their dads were both kind of rivals, and he gets in and he basically shoots this guy and steals his notes. And the guy, of course, is telling him, that's whoever Miss Bruner is not my mother. You're totally mistaken. But we see some real acts. He shoots a woman in the back, and there's no empathy shown here again. Very interesting protagonist here, because he's at points I felt like he was a Mary Sue, but he is the furthest thing from a Mary Sue, because he has huge flaws. He is an incredibly, he seems like a slightly deranged person, most definitely. So he goes back to Miss Bruner and he gives her the notes, and he's like, why did you lie to me? He can't be your son. And she's like, no, he's not my son. I lied to you. And he's finally had enough, and Miss Bruner's like, you need to go take a vacation. And so he leaves and hitchhikes into Sweden, and eventually meets a woman, and I don't know how to pronounce her name, but he meets, I think she's a teacher, and her name is Maj Britt. Maj-Britt. Maj Britt. And she takes a liking to him, and he's going by a pseudonym here in Sweden, and he rises again to his popularity that he enjoyed in London. So he's starting to feel like himself again. He joins a band, and eventually he marries Maj Britt, and life is going great. And then he comes home one day, and Mrs. Bruner is there, and she's basically saying, hey, the vacation's up, the computer's done, I need you back in the caves. And he's like, no, and she uses her powers of seduction on both him and his wife, Maj Britt, and that ends phase 3. Phase 4 opens with them back in the caverns, and Maj Britt is completely taken, seduced by Miss Bruner, and Jerry is too. They're both very happy, and Jerry seems, for the first time in the novel, completely content. He's completely content, and I don't know if this is through Miss Bruner or himself. I feel like it's through Miss Bruner, but anyway, they are becoming, Jerry and Miss Bruner are becoming more and more of a team, and there's the government of Sweden is trying to figure out what is going on, and eventually they get some police in there. I think right before that is when Jerry and Miss Bruner sleep with each one of their servants, and Jerry is able to make Maj Britt disappear the way that Miss Bruner does as well. And that's when she tells him, anybody can do it, you just have to learn how. Anyway, they bring some police into the compound of the caves, and Jerry ends up getting shot in the chest and is in a coma for a while, and then he wakes up. The great thing, whatever she's been working for, is about to happen, and she announces it to the crowd, and he sees this in a dream but also in reality. It's very difficult to tell if his body's there or not. So there is a hint in this book that the machine is made out of human brains, which I found really interesting. Like they linked all these human brains together to get all this knowledge, and they took all this knowledge out of these human brains, and it turns out that what her big plan for this computer is that it's going to merge her and Jerry and create a perfect hermaphroditic being that has all the knowledge of humankind in its brain. And she does this. They get into the machine and start making love, and he can feel her sucking into him. And then the machine starts feeding all this knowledge, and he becomes a hermaphrodite. And this new hermaphrodite, they call, I think at first, Cornelius Brunner, and it says, "Call me Corn." And the crowd of scientists, which is huge, go into a frenzy at the creation of this godlike being. And that's what Miss Brunner, before she merges with Jerry, calls it, is we're making a god. And they also call it an all-purpose human. The first all-purpose human. So the scientists lift up Corn onto their shoulders and start moving en masse out of the cave. And they go through Sweden, and the crowd gets bigger. And the end of phase 4, I hope this is phase 4, yes, is a description of Corn being carried by a crowd, just walking from country to country. And every country he visits, more and more people join him, and soon thousands swell into millions, and they're calling him the new Messiah and the prophet and all this stuff. And eventually, like, he goes through France, and there's only 4 people that are left in not France, Paris. He goes through Paris, and there's only 4 people left in Paris when he leaves. He goes through Rome, and the only person that doesn't join the adoring crowds of this new Messiah is the Pope, and even he runs after and joins them in about an hour. I feel like the missing information from the person that she called her son that Jerry killed and took is probably data from Jerry's father, who was working on this hallucinogenic weapon. And her son, when Jerry went there, was working on was researching his dad's same stuff, a way to make a medicated society, basically through hallucinogenic drugs, that everybody would be happy and useful all the time. And I think that she added into the computer, and then the being that was created by them coming together and forming one being. They also added the power of this psychedelic trance drug thing that his dad had been working on. And that's why people instantly, when they see Corn, go nuts for it. Just absolutely worship right away. So a huge millions and millions of people in the world's population carry Corn wherever Corn wants to go. And finally Corn says, let's go to the ocean. I think it's the Black Sea, and has them run into the Black Sea, carrying them. And eventually only Corn's head is sticking out from above the water. And this is written incredibly. Michael Moorcock really described this well. And then Corn just swims back to the shore and decides that the world is delicious and he wants everybody. He wants everybody. And that's where phase 4 ends, with Corn laying on the beach and going to sleep. And then there's a section called Terminal Data, and Corn goes to Cornelius's father's house and blows it up. And a cop shows up and is like, hey, I know the world's falling apart, but there still are rules here, and I'm a cop and I'm going to arrest you. And Corn instantly hypnotizes him. I think it is connected to the LSD research that Jerry's dad was doing. So Corn instantly seduces the cop, pulls down his pants, and turns him around and pats him on the bottom and pushes him away. The last lines of the book. A moment later, the world's first all-purpose human being strode eastward whistling. A tasty world, it reflected cheerfully. A very tasty world. You said it, Cornelius. This is a wild book that bucks against traditional narrative, that bucks against the character arc of protagonist. I feel like the birth of this god is not good. I mean, millions are killed by drowning because of the creation of this all-purpose human being, this first all-purpose human being. And honestly, it was weird, and I enjoyed every moment of it. And I think that has to do with Michael Moorcock's storytelling and his prose, which are both absolutely incredible. This is probably the most focused psychedelic 60s sci-fi book that I've read so far, and I really enjoyed it. I learned a couple of interesting things about it that I just wanted to let you know really quick. Apparently, when Michael Moorcock wrote this, he decided he wanted to tell a story he'd already told in Elric saga stuff. He wanted to tell it in a more sci-fi way, and this is that story. The Dreaming City and the and While the Gods Laugh are apparently the two Elric stories that he took as the plot for this novel. So that's interesting. Apparently Miss Brunner is Stormbringer, which is cool, and it makes sense with the sword-eating souls and all that. That's exactly what Miss Brunner's doing. Also, he wanted this book initially to be a multimedia experience, which I find really cool. He wanted there to be a tape that this came with of music that you would listen to while you read it, which I think is an incredible idea. I really love this idea. In the end, I don't have an overarching theme that I can connect this to. Another interesting thing that I read about this is that apparently this is the more normal of the Jerry Cornelius books. He took this character and wrote other stories that are apparently blow this one out of the water in weirdness, so I'm very much looking forward to those. I don't know if it's Korn or Jerry Cornelius that are in these other books. It'd be interesting to find out which Jerry Cornelius we're seeing. In the end, as this being my first Michael Moorcock book, I know I'm going to read more. I can sense his intelligence, and I can sense his artistic prowess. Beautiful prose in these, a lot of really interesting things to say, and I think that there's going to be so much more that we can add to this channel from this writer. So I do highly recommend this book. I think it's very cool. I especially recommend it if you like weird sci-fi. I also especially recommend it if you have any interest in the history of the underground London movement in the mid to late 60s, because I feel like this book talks about it in a way through many passages that I haven't heard it talked about before, where we actually get to see somebody at the time speaking very artistically about what the aims of this movement are, and I found that really enjoyable. And I think you guys will too if you're interested in that. If you love psychedelic music, prog rock, any of this kind of music, I think you'll also really enjoy this book. It was a really good time. So, all right, that's my deep reading on The Final Program by Michael Moorcock. If you watched it to the end, thank you very much. If you liked it, click like. If you like this kind of content, click subscribe, because we'll be making a lot more of it in the future. And thank you so much for watching.